live. We are now getting started live. Hello, everybody who is tuning in now for the Equality Florida post-session debrief Facebook live town hall. My name is Joe Saunders. We have a panel of guests for you today that are true powerhouse. And in true Facebook Live form, we know that folks are joining as we speak. And so if you are joining with us right at the very beginning of today's hour, you know that we're going to hold for just a minute or two and kiki with each other while we wait for people to join. And then we've got a packed agenda of dynamic conversation with some of the smartest people I know in Florida. So just hang out with us for a minute or two while our guests and online supporters join. If you are joining with us right now, I can share with you, I'm Joe Saunders, Senior Political Director for Equality Florida. There will be an opportunity to ask lots of questions throughout today's conversation. The chat or the comment section of Facebook and YouTube, depending on which you're viewing on, is available to you and is a way to ask us questions. So this is going to be a back and forth conversation between Equality Florida's public policy team of advocates and some dynamic LGBTQ elected officials in Florida. Hang out with us for just a minute or two and we will get started in a minute.
Rep Smith, are
How are
you?
my panelists doing?
We're good. It's a beautiful day in Tallahassee.
Beautiful day in Tallahassee. It's a little gloomy in South Beach right now, actually.
People can't hear us right now?
Oh, I think they can.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, hi, Susan.
Hi there. Oh, wow. I'm just really excited to have everyone join us for this post-session legislative update. I love seeing all of your smiling faces. Representative Webb, we need to go back to Tallahassee to do more work. That's for sure.
We'll be back there by June, I think.
Probably so. I think you're right.
Y'all are always welcome.
Oh, good. Yeah, dibs on John Harris's house.
For our viewers who are joining in, know that we are not staring at the Facebook screen that you're staring at, but we can see your comments. So if you want to give us a shout out and let us know you're here, we see that Susan Lee just said, hello, Susan Lee from Tampa, an amazing member of Equality Florida and the progressive community in the Tampa Bay area. If you're joining and you're watching us, say hi to us on the comment section, and we're happy to say hi to you as well. Well, y'all, here's the thing. We got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and get started. I see Wes Davis is here, our dynamic field director. We have a ton of ground to cover in the short hour that we have. And for those of you who are joining us now, let's get started with the Equality Florida post-session debrief and Facebook Live Town Hall by introducing our panelists. This is such a powerhouse team. I can tell you that when you can't see them, they're actively producing this event for us. But when the Equality Florida communications team suggested this town hall and we started riffing on who we might book for it, I started to get really excited because you'd think that the four of us are all talking to each other basically face-to-face often, but it doesn't happen as often as you think because we're all buzzing bees running around the state, except for when we're in the Capitol together. So this is actually the first time that the four of us here have had a chance to really sit down together and talk about what we think happened this session and what it really means, not just for the state right now, but for the next session and for our LGBTQ community moving forward. My name is Joe Saunders. I am a former state representative from Orlando, the current senior political director for Equality Florida. When I was sworn in 2012 to the Florida House, I was the first LGBT elected official to take that oath of office. Joining us today is State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, the first LGBTQ Latinx member of the Florida legislature, calling in from his home in Orlando. And also office in Orlando. And also joining us is State Representative Jennifer Webb from her home in sunny St. Pete, the first lesbian elected to the Florida legislature. And finally, we have with us the first lady of LGBTQ Tallahassee and Equality Florida's public policy director, a total dynamic leader, and our chief advocate in the Florida legislature during session, John Harris Maurer. So today, in the time that we have, and as a reminder, if you're joining us, I know folks stream into these, you can say hi to us, say hi in the comment section, let us know we're here, let us know you're here. And also, as we're going through this conversation, ask us questions. The comment section of YouTube and Facebook are available to you to ask questions. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can. And in the lead up to this, we asked folks, we solicited questions from our community about what they wanted us to cover, and that's baked into some of the places we want to go. From the beginning of the opening of session to a slate of 8 terrible bills that, had they passed, would have repealed local protections, to the insidious transgender youth medical care ban, to bills that could have, had they passed, incited the outing of students in schools, all the way to some really amazing work happening around bills like the Florida Competitive Workforce Act and efforts to update Florida's HIV laws. This was a crazy session. That isn't even the full list. But we're going to talk about all those things today as a team, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end of our hour talking about what we think the COVID crisis means for our community, how the state is responding, and what we should expect from Tallahassee in the coming months. So we're going to hit all of those topics. But let's just dive right into it. John Harris, I'm going to start off by throwing this to you. We know that Equality Florida ended this session, once again, having defeated or neutralized every anti-LGBTQ bill filed, and there were many this session. But I think, and I think you agree with me, we got to start at the beginning in order to fully tell the story of what this session was like. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about what the atmosphere was like walking into the 2020 legislative session? What did Equality Florida expect this would look like for our community this year?
Sure, thanks, Joe. I'll say we were pretty positive and optimistic going into the legislative session. There were a couple of data points sort of coming in over the course of summer that really showed some good signs for our community and our legislative agenda. They were often born out of challenging moments that sort of brought to bear ultimately some good signs. And so one of those early ones that really popped up onto our radar out of nowhere was some really egregious, terrible comments from Representative Mike Hill and the Panhandle, laughing at a horrendous joke about stoning gay people to death. It was completely a shock. But what was encouraging that came out of that moment that was so awful was the response from legislators across both sides of the aisle and even legislative leadership clearly condemning that rhetoric and making clear that there's no place for that in the Florida legislature. Now, that's not a terribly high bar, but those were some positive indications showing that the legislature at least wouldn't tolerate that sort of language and that disposition. Another really big moment coming into session was around the 3rd year mark of Pulse. As folks may remember, originally Governor DeSantis issued a proclamation that failed to acknowledge the LGBTQ community at all. And that was really hurtful for obvious reasons, and really surprising because we'd even had that discussion previously, with statewide leadership about how important it was to recognize the impact of Pulse on the LGBTQ community. And fortunately, in very short order, after that was brought to light publicly by some of our allies on this town hall, Representative Anna Escamani, who's one of our primary accomplices to the LGBTQ community, as she says, Governor DeSantis did issue a revised proclamation that recognized the impact of the massacre at Pulse on the LGBTQ community and on the Latinx community. And he came to Pulse. And he really had that moment, including with some of our staff members, to appreciate the significance of what that 3rd year mark meant. And he made some encouraging comments while he was there as well, acknowledging that he would support, once again, funding for a Pulse Museum and Memorial, and also pledging to look into the issue of non-discrimination protections for state contractors. So that gave us a pretty good feeling heading into session about sort of where we were. As our legislative slate came together, we were also excited about bipartisan leadership on the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, sponsored by Representative Webb, as well as our Republican Representative Toledo, and also led by Representative Holly Roshine, a Republican from Key West, who's been a long time, very close ally of our community. And that sort of bipartisan support is really important in the process, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But all those were really encouraging signs. And then right as we were about to kick off session, all of these terrible bills get filed. And you probably heard us talk about the slate of 8. And this was a laundry list of bills that were either directly coming for our community, like the transgender youth medical care ban, that was a clear attack on the LGBTQ community, particularly our trans members, or they were bills that would have rolled back critical existing local protections through preemption. So a lot of really scary steps coming right as we headed into the beginning of session.
So one of the challenges with this call is that there is so much to cover, and there's so many places just in that I want to dig in. First, a couple of quick shout outs. We won't get to everybody, but hey, Jeff Fantastic, thank you for joining. I see Scott Bennett, who's been a longtime supporter of Equality Florida, and I think has come to every lobby days for the last 6 years on the line. So we've got, it's lovely and amazing to see so many of the folks who have rearranged their lives to join us in Tallahassee. I think it does make sense to dig in more deeply into the slate of 8 first, but before we can talk about what the slate of 8 was, these bills that really threatened our protections, I think you got to start at the most basic question, which is what is preemption? And Rep Webb, I think this makes sense to throw at you. You know, preemption is this thing that most Floridians probably have never heard of. It's a word that would be new for them, but it's become this really, really important issue across a lot of areas of policy and life in Florida. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? What is preemption and why should it matter to the average Floridian?
I would love to talk about that because no Florida rep has more cities in their district than I have. I have 12 cities, and they each of those municipalities exercise, home rule over their cities. And so basically in Florida, unless it's stated in our statute or in the Constitution, local government has control over things that aren't expressly stated in statute or in the Constitution. And what has been happening recently is that the state has been preempting local control. So the preemption is actually, I'm preempting local government from passing laws that work for local families and local businesses and local zoning to the state. And we're going to have a one-size-fits-all policy. Now, that could be really great when it comes to environmental policy and increasing protections, but it could be really bad if it's about rolling back protections. And so what we saw a lot of this session was rolling back of protections that currently exist at the local level that Equality Florida and your partners have worked so hard to pass at the local level. Things like banning conversion therapy for youth, protecting employees from discrimination, all of these local ordinances in our city that our cities are really leading the way on. Right now, what is it? 50% of Floridians are protected by some sort of non-discrimination statute at the local level. Is that correct?
60. I think we've reached 60 at this point.
Right. And so we're at a situation where the state could bring us the rest of the way, or it could take us back to where we were at the early 2000s. And that would be devastating for our families who are currently enjoying those protections. And so preemption really is just the state taking control over areas that were normally deemed the realm of local government. So your cities and counties.
Absolutely. So if you're tuning in now, just real quick, I'll pause for a second to remind you who you have on this Facebook Live program. You've got State Representative Jennifer Webb, the first lesbian elected to the Florida legislature and a true trailblazer and groundbreaker. You've got State Representative Guillermo Smith, Florida's first LGBTQ Latinx legislator. He's just okay. He's just all right. And you've got John Harris Maurer, the Public Policy Director for Equality Florida. He has charmed more Republicans from doing things they shouldn't do than anyone else I know. So the total powerhouse panel talking with us here today. And I'm, of course, Joe Saunders, your Equality Florida Senior Political Director. So John Harris, preemption has to be talked about first before we begin talking about the slate of 8, because so many of the bills that we found ourselves dealing with, many of which were filed at the 11th hour, right up to the bill filing deadline of bills in the 2020 legislative session, were preemption bills. And those really ran the gamut. We've talked about this quite a bit, but give us a preview into what some of those bills were and what they did and why they were such a threat.
Sure. So the first preemption bill that was a huge issue on our radar was the preemption of employment conditions. And our concern there was the way that the state was seeking to seize control over the issue of employment conditions. And those are things like wages, scheduling, leave time. And it really has an intersection with the protections that we've established with our partners over years on the local level. And so our fear was that that bill would roll back some of those employment protections that we'd worked so hard to secure for the LGBTQ community. And it wasn't a new bill. It's a piece of legislation that we've seen in some form or fashion before. The session before had a really great working relationship with the Restaurant and Lodging Association, which was one of the big industry business groups interested in the bill. And really sort of struggled with them this session to try to figure out, a way that we could meet both their interests and also help them understand that, we were hearing from their members that really care about these sort of protections and didn't want to lose those protections at the local level. So that bill was a real challenge for us. It did end up moving through some of its House committees, but fortunately never made it to the House floor, didn't pass through the Senate. So that one ultimately died. For our other preemption legislation, we did succeed in working with the bill sponsors, working with some of the bill backers to get favorable amendments so that we could at least address how those bills would impact LGBTQ protections. And a couple of those bills that were really important to us were first this local licensing preemption bill and this other home-based business preemption bill. And the technicalities of what the bills do aren't as important as the threat. The threat was that these bills could roll back our local protections against conversion therapy. I'm sure many of you already know conversion therapy is the widely debunked and discredited, quote unquote, pray the gay away practice that every mainstream medical and mental health association has said is not only ineffective, but ultimately we know that it can cause real harm and even be potentially deadly. So when we talked to these bill sponsors, they said, our intent isn't to impact these protections, but it's important for Equality Florida and all the advocates, like our folks who came to lobby days, to be in the Capitol and make clear that the intent isn't what matters. What we're focused on is the impact. And if it's going to have this impact of rolling back local protections, we're going to show up every time. And fortunately, we were able, again, in these cases, to work with the bill sponsors to make sure that we could make some tweaks to the bill language so that it wouldn't impact those sort of local protections that are so important.
So, Rep. Smith, Carlos, I want to turn the focus to an area where you really led. But first, before we jump to one of the most insidious bills that we saw filed, it feels like to me that we see this recurring theme. This isn't the first time that we've seen anti-LGBT bills broadly filed. It's not the first time that we've seen preemption bills filed that our community is impacted by, which may not have been the intent of the bill, but it's certainly a challenge as soon as it happens. And so we're seeing this sort of cascading or recurrent tension between interests that are really interested in shifting the way that local governments engage in policymaking and this moment when it begins to cascade on LGBT rights. And the theme that feels like it's emerging is if the LGBTQ community is caught up in your bill and you don't address it, your bill dies. That is the theme of this session. The bill sponsors that weren't willing to work with us and weren't willing to acknowledge that our protections were hurt by their bill did not see their bills passed. And that has been a theme for a few years in a row. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why do you think in a conservative legislative environment, we continue to see that tension?
Well, that's a really good question, and it goes really in depth in really just kind of what happens in state legislatures. You've got two different kinds of anti-LGBTQ bills that always come up. You have the overtly anti-LGBTQ bill, something that wants to, for example, ban transgender Floridians from using public restrooms or taking away healthcare from trans youth, which is just mean-spirited. It's an overt attack on our community, and we fight to oppose it. And that was their point. Their point was to attack our community. Then you have this other subset of bills that are also anti-LGBT in their impact, but they're not necessarily created for the purpose of attacking our community. We had a lot of those this year, to John Harris's point and to your point, bills that took away the rights of local governments to have pro-worker ordinances and laws. Well, it just so happened they were written in ways that ordinances and laws that we had written at the city and county level that were specifically intended on protecting LGBTQ workers for a specific set of issues happened to get caught up in those other bills. Now, what happens is when we go and we speak to these lawmakers and we say, hey, listen, your bill is also taking away these hard-fought gains that we got at the local level for LGBTQ workers. We find that it doesn't really make obviously a difference to our constituents whether the point was to attack LGBTQ workers or not, because the outcome is still the same. They've had their rights and protections taken away. But to your point, what became a third rail in Florida politics is the second your bill is labeled anti-LGBTQ means that the full force of our community, the grassroots effort, everything that comes with our families and our allies opposing your bill start to come out of the woodwork, which doesn't guarantee our success. We have to fight hard to defeat these bills every session they come up, whether they were intended to attack the LGBT community or not. But to them, also, the difference doesn't matter because we're coming at them and opposing their bill. And most of these, and I'll just say Republican lawmakers, have eventually had to remove aspects that affected our community so that they could possibly reduce the number of people who were opposing their bill. But most of the times, the underlying bill in question was bad policy, regardless of how it impacted our community.
Right, and an important point to highlight, right? We have seen in state after state that the public's appetite for bills that, in effect, whether by intention or not, repeal local LGBT protections, to Representative Webb's point, bills that roll back, actually move us backwards and take away really critical protections around employment or housing or to access public spaces, that the public has no appetite for it and that there are consequences. So I always think about North Carolina, who saw hundreds of millions of dollars, economic consequences, hundreds of millions of dollars of economic damage that resulted in a total shift in the political climate. The only governor who lost re-election in 2016 was Pat McCrory, the Republican governor who had spearheaded the passage of a preemption bill that rolled back local protections in North Carolina. So, that seems to be the math here. And the challenge is that some lawmakers either don't get it or don't care. We always end up being in this back and forth fight about it. But there was one bill that really go ahead, Rep. Webb, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's also the privilege of heteronormativity, right? Like, I am so privileged that I come from such a heteronormative kind of environment that I don't have to think, how will this influence the LGBTQ plus community? And I think that what we'll see, so we're still at that point, right, where they roll out bills as soon as they see that it impacts our community and that we are going to put up a fight, and that wasn't necessarily their intention. To John Harris's point, they pull them out, but they are still, that's not their starting place. And so I think that our challenge is to get our colleagues and to move where their starting point, to stop, to begin by questioning how will this preemption impact the LGBTQ plus community, because that's not my intention to negatively impact them. And I'm going to take the 20 minutes to think, how is this going to impact those families in my district? And we're just not there yet. Yeah. Yeah.
Indifference does just as much harm, right? Yeah. The fact that you don't see us doesn't mean you don't hurt us. And where that makes me go in my mind is the importance of openly LGBTQ elected officials, right? Like sitting in those spaces, sitting in spaces of power, being forced to sit across the table with us and have a real conversation. You can't dismiss a colleague in the same way that you can dismiss the hundreds of phone calls that come into your office. And I think there are so many examples, and we're going to talk about them today. There's so many examples of how LGBTQ elected officials forced the centering of our community. And I think the next place we were going to go is a really good example of that. So Rep. Smith, one of the bills that we realized absolutely had to be killed in the cradle. It was one of these bills that was filed at the 11th hour, the transgender youth medical care ban. I think everyone on this call had it on our radar the moment in which it was filed, because it exists exclusively for the purpose of attacking and dehumanizing the most vulnerable LGBTQ Floridians, transgender young people. But Rep. Smith, you really kind of led the charge on this, in part because the first committee of reference was a committee that you sit on for that bill, and the momentum was coming from the House. The lead sponsor pushing it the hardest was in the House. So talk to us a little bit more about the transgender youth medical care ban. What was the story of that bill? Where did it come from, and how did we kill it?
Right. Well, that's a great question. A lot of Equality Florida's members, our families, our supporters around the state heard about this bill during legislative session. Many of them actually came up to Tallahassee to provide testimony against this bill. Many of them wrote their senators, wrote their state representatives, which was all very, very helpful, because what this bill did was it made it a crime for a doctor to provide life-saving health care to transgender youth. Whether that was hormonal therapy or any other type of health care that we know is very, very helpful and life-saving care for trans youth. We say life-saving, and then we had to explain it. You know, there's a lot of ignorant folks out there, but there's certainly a lot of ignorant elected officials as well. We had to walk them through how important this healthcare is for transgender youth. We had to walk them through the very disturbing statistics that tell us that transgender youth are disproportionately more likely to think about suicide, but also to attempt suicide, according to our surveys and our data and our statistics, and that having access to things like HRT, hormonal therapy, other forms of gender-affirming care substantially reduces the risk of suicide as well. In addition to so many other things, we had to educate them, while at the same time, we also, Joe, during that first committee that it was heard in Tallahassee, we had to expose the ugly implications of how this law would be implemented. What does it mean to criminalize a doctor for providing health care? What does it mean the way that it was written? We had to call that out in a public committee where we had to paint a story. And I remember literally saying this in committee in front of many of those families, in front of many transgender Floridians, lawmakers, where I said, listen, if this bill passes into law, someone could call the local sheriff's office to report a doctor providing health care to trans youth. The sheriff's office would then walk into the doctor's office, possibly armed, possibly their guns drawn, while a doctor is seeing other patients. They would go into that room, they would handcuff the doctor, and they would haul them down to the county jail, where that doctor would then await trial to possibly go to prison for 15 years for prescribing hormonal therapy to a 17-year-old transgender Floridian. The idea that that would happen in this state in the year 2020 is not only offensive, but it's dangerous for our community, which is why we had to push back very hard. The reason the bill was killed is because we had trans Floridians and their families and parents and trans youth themselves stand up in the committee and tell their stories. They lifted their own voices and talked about what would happen if this bill was implemented. We heard so many powerful testimonies from these folks that really made a difference. I had
Yep.
Republican lawmakers approach me after the committee was all said and done, acknowledging to me privately this bill was bad policy, would have disastrous outcomes. But what they also admitted to me privately was that they didn't fully comprehend or understand the consequences of this legislation until they heard from those directly impacted. And that was how we really killed the bill. And one other thing, I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Representative Amy Mercado,
Yes.
because she told a very powerful story herself when she came in and told the committee about how her daughter is transgender and talked about what her family went through when her daughter came out to her as trans, and what they had to do to support her and create a supportive environment for her so that she could be successful and she could thrive. And it was a very emotional story, certainly, but that story, in addition to so many others, really had an impact and is what ultimately helped us kill the bill. But we have to remain vigilant, because our success this year in killing this bill does not mean that it won't come back in a future session, perhaps in another form. So we really have to keep on it and keep telling our stories, certainly.
Absolutely.
And I just want to put a highlighter around that moment in that hearing, because it was probably the best moment of session that I felt, really because of the tremendous organizing that we saw from supporters, a lot of whom I can see in the comment thread now, whether they were coming up throughout session for our press conferences like Stephanie, Sean coming up for different lobby days. And really when this hearing came about, it was right after we'd had more than 100 organizers from around the state come to Tallahassee to participate in our lobby days event, which was incredible. And then days, if not just hours later, we got notice of this bill coming up for consideration. And again, people from around the state turned around. I mean, some of them literally found some means to borrow a plane and fly up from South Florida on like 36 hours notice and be in Tallahassee. And it was just an incredible effort. And I'm so thankful for all those individuals, some of the organizations I see represented here as well. Hannah Willard, who's sort of former Family for Equality Florida, Dr. Danielle Thomas with PTA, Charo Valero with FLAN, all these organizations really pushing together that just blew this bill out of the water. And I was tremendously proud, because I think the strength of that moment in Florida and the leadership of not only our activists, but also the openly LGBTQ leaders and lawmakers on this teleconference, as well as Representative Chevron Jones, so showed the flaws in this legislation that I think it really helped stop or slow down these similar bills that we saw filed around the country. There was such a blowout in Florida. I mean, we could feel the impact that it was having and reverberating nationally.
Absolutely. So important to point out.
One thing I would add to that. Okay, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll come right back to you, Carlos. And I have a question actually for both you and Rep. Webb related to this. But if you're joining us, a couple of things. So we are Facebook Living with you at Equality Florida's actually very first legislative Facebook Live Town Hall. This is our post-session 2020 debrief, accompanied by State Representative Jennifer Webb and State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, two of the three openly LGBT members of the Florida legislature. I'm Joe Saunders, your Equality Florida Senior Political Director. John Harris Maurer, our Public Policy Director, and I are tip of the spear in Tallahassee, fighting for you. And if you have joined us, we can't see that you've joined until you comment. So if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, throw a quick comment on there so we know you're here. And this is a dialogue we hope to have with you who are watching. So if you have a question based on what you're hearing and you want to dig in a little bit deeper and know a little bit more, or you want us to cover a completely different topic, let us know and we'll try to get to it. I'm going to go a little bit off script, John Harris, from some of the pathway you charted for us, just to go here. It feels to me like a theme of the 2020 session is, post-marriage, I think all of us who are advocates, and all of us are, right? Everybody on this call, before you were an elected official, you were an activist doing LGBT organizing in your community. We all heard right after marriage this sort of question of, well, will organizations like Equality Florida matter anymore? Will the importance of openly LGBT elected officials in some of these spaces, even the more conservative ones, matter? Is this all going to be wrapped up in a big bow really quickly? And I think the theme from 2020 is, no, if anything, there are some who will take even more aggressive bites at that anti-LGBTQ apple, that there is still a base of people in this state that some people feel like they need to score political points with. I think that's what we saw with Senator Dennis Baxley and Representative Anthony Sabatini. We're going to name names on this Facebook Live town hall. I think that's what this bill is about. But the counterpoint to that is that the coalition of support is the greatest it's ever been, that the Republican coalition around LGBT rights and equality is the largest it's ever been. And Rep. Webb, you've been tip of the spear since being elected as a lead co-sponsor, a lead sponsor of the Competitive Workforce Act, and now the primary co-sponsor in stewarding and growing that coalition. What role do you think pro-equality Republicans play in the Florida legislature? What impact did that coalition have on killing the trans medical care ban, for example?
Actually, and I'm glad that you asked that, because Carlos, when you were sharing the play-by-play of unfolding in the committee, what I was thinking about was the lunchroom conversations that we were having with our colleagues.
That's right.
Talking about this bill, and that moment when we were talking to Dr. Masulo, our colleague in the legislature, who is a doctor, and he said, and he finally stopped and he said, "So you're telling me that this is a bad solution in search of a problem, that this doesn't happen?" And Carlos and I both said, yes, that's exactly what we're telling you. And we're telling you that not only would this be a neutral move, this would be a devastating move to our trans community. And here are the statistics on, suicide rates and health and well-being rates for our trans brothers and sisters. And he really, I felt, and Carlos, correct me, I would love to hear your impression, but I really felt like he got it and he took that information to others.
Yeah, there was certainly a good handful of our Republican colleagues who were opposed to the bill, who helped, by the way, turn the bill away from a scheduled vote and into a workshop. Republican representatives like Renee Plasencia, who had pledged his opposition to the bill. He was the vice chair of the committee. And I believe in part that one of the reasons why the bill was turned into a workshop and the vote was canceled on the bill was because the vote count started to shift underneath them, and they had to. The other thing that I'll just point out about this bill is how important it is to use facts and scientific data. I know that in the age of COVID-19, you see a lot of folks not really sticking to the facts and to the science. But you also probably know from experience during these times that even in the medical field or in the scientific field, you can often sometimes find that one organization that is totally off. Well, it just so happens that there was only one so-called healthcare organization that was willing to say that this bill was a good idea. It also just happened to be an organization that was designated by Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. And that, of course, is the American College of Pediatrics. But the American College of Pediatrics was substantially outnumbered by every major healthcare organization in the country who opposed this bill. Organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association. The list goes on of these medical groups who understand how important this life-saving care is for transgender youth, which is why they opposed this bill. They were the adults in the room who came in with the science and with the facts, and they helped shut it down. So I want to thank them as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I got to read a shout out from Hannah Willard, who is a former member of the Equality Florida team, but now works for one of our strongest and most influential national LGBTQ rights partners. And I just want to give this to all of you because it's a nice shout out. Hannah from Freedom for All Americans says, I cannot underscore enough how much your victory in Florida helped squash momentum nationwide. We saw nearly 50 targeted anti-trans bills across the country, and about half were similar to the anti-trans medical care ban in Florida. You all at Equality Florida, inclusive of our LGBTQ state reps, did what you always do, own best practices and innovative strategy that helped your LGBTQ community and family members squash similar attacks in other states. I think it is, I'm so glad you elevated this, John Harris, because for a couple of reasons. One, we know that we have to anticipate that attacks on trans youth will come back. We know that this is the new tip of the spear. There are two things we see from our opponents in states across the country and folks like Hannah, our tip of the spear in supporting groups like Equality Florida all over. We're seeing anti-LGBT bills related to sports and anti-LGBT bills related to trans young people, whether it be young people being able to access same-sex sex-segregated facilities in schools, young people being able to access bathrooms. In this case, it's young people being able to access healthcare. And the urgency of us being prepared for that and ready to fight back is so important. These kids are the most vulnerable we have, and I know that everybody here agrees with that. But let's pivot towards another topic. There's a lot to cover. Rep Webb, as we mentioned before, you have been fighting the good fight since you got elected to pass proactive LGBT rights legislation. The Florida Competitive Workforce Act, which when I was elected, had the very real honor of being a lead sponsor of. That torch has been passed to you, and now you as a primary co-to State Representative Jackie Toledo, a Republican from Tampa. What's the story of the Competitive Workforce Act this session? What did we win, and where did we fall short?
Well, so where we won this session was, generally sessions right before elections are kind of quiet when it comes to policy. And that's what I was told, like, not a lot's going to move. And we saw that play out. Not a lot got passed and not a lot moved. However, this was the most sponsored piece of legislation of the session. And so, again, like, we reached out to our Republican allies and our Democratic caucus and got just tons of representatives and senators to sponsor. We also had Senator Roussan did a very good job of reaching out and getting more senators to co-sponsor this legislation than have ever co-sponsored the legislation before. And just in case somebody is brand new to the Equality Florida family, the Florida Competitive Workforce Act expands the Civil Rights Act of 1992 to protect individuals based on sexual orientation and gender identity when it comes to employment, public accommodations, and housing. And so, and it's a very important piece of the legislation. We mentioned earlier that about 60% of our residents in Florida are protected by an anti-LGBT or by pro-LGBTQ inclusive policies. This would extend it the rest of the way to protect everyone in Florida. And it's good for business. The business community wants it as well. And so what we saw is we, did a good job. Our business partners did a great job of coming in and rallying around it. We had a lot of excitement, a lot of bipartisan support. And unfortunately, Speaker Oliva said, absolutely not, no go. And so, as we know, in Florida, there are just a few people who set the agenda for what gets to move and what doesn't. And because I put the kibosh on it, basically, that was the end of it, being able to move in the House. And I'm hopeful that before my term is up, or before my time in the House is up, I'm hopeful that we'll see it passed. I was speaking to some friends of mine who are firefighters because, they passed their big cancer presumption bill last year. And I was like, God, I'm so proud of y'all. That's awesome. I keep fighting for the LGBTQ plus community and haven't gotten anywhere yet. And he said, Sharon, how long has it been since y'all been introducing this legislation? I was like, a decade. And he said, we fought for 16 years to get firefighters the protection that they need. You can keep fighting. And I was like, okay, I absolutely can keep fighting. I am so privileged. And then in that moment, all of my all of the greats on whose shoulders I stand like came into focus. Like we've just celebrated a huge anniversary for Stonewall. I mean, I came out before Will and Grace, like a lot of our older people. So it was like a tough time back then. And I'm like, oh, we know how to fight and we can keep going. And it's important. And we're educating people along the way. And we're not leaving anyone out, you know, and that's the most important thing. And that shows that our community has learned from our past errors. And so I'm super pumped to work on it again next year.
Well, and you know what I think is really important for people to hear, and it's what I say when I kind of do the talk around Competitive Workforce Act. When I first got elected, there had never been a Republican who was willing to co-sponsor a single piece of LGBT legislation. And Holly Rayshine, who I know who is in senior leadership this year, teamed up with you and Republican Representative Jackie Toledo. We never found the right way to refer to the three of you, except for like the three fiercest women in the Florida legislature. I know we played with fierce a lot, but Holly was the very first. And now there are over a dozen Republicans who aren't just promising to vote for it, but who are advocating for it, who are lobbying on it, who are working with you on it. So we can see the progress and trend line, even while, you know, and I think this is maybe the most important thing for people to walk away with. Your bill, the Competitive Workforce Act, was the most popular, most co-sponsored bill in the Florida legislature again. For more than 2 years in a row. It has had the most support. No other bill can claim that kind of momentum. And yet, leadership, we had an environment where Speaker Oliva straight up told reporters at the end of session, I don't see the need for this legislation. I don't know why we need this. And that is clearly where the problem lies. It's right at that leadership level. Okay, we're going to run out of time. And there are a couple of questions that are popping up from the comments, but I want to get to some stuff that I know is important to people who are watching. John Harris, you have been the lead advocate, lead lobbyist on an effort to modernize Florida's HIV laws, archaic laws written back in the 80s that do not connect to the reality of science today. That was such an important piece of legislation for us. What is the future of the effort to modernize HIV laws in Florida? What happened this session? What should we expect next year?
Sure. Well, before I jump in, I'm also excited to thank some of the great advocates that we had around this issue who came up to the Capitol. So greetings to folks from Ariana Center who are on the call, and also one of our constant allies in the Capitol, folks from Faith and Public Life. This is my first live webinar like this. Brandon would say that's obvious from my lighting. But I love seeing all those comments come in and everybody who's jumping on. So thanks for that. On HIV modernization, that was one of the success stories of session. We did see progress there. We worked as part of the Florida HIV Justice Coalition really closely hand in hand with our sponsors, Senator Jason Pizzo and Representative Nick Duran, to advance this legislation. And we did get it successfully through one of the Senate committees. And then the other place that we really found it had real legs was around a particular provision for organ donation. And it should seem pretty commonplace, but right now in Florida, because we have tremendously outdated HIV laws, it is a third-degree felony for somebody living with HIV to donate organs, plasma, tissue, or blood to another person living with HIV. And this idea of blood donation has obviously come up a lot at the moment in sort of our COVID-19 world. But it's just crazy that even with all of the screening that is in place, all these medical reviews and cautionary and informed consent, it is still illegal even for that sort of a life-saving organ donation. So we worked with our bill sponsors and we worked with some other lawmakers, and ultimately were able to get amendments onto other bills that carried that provision. And so we were so excited about that movement. In fact, it was amended into 2 different Republican bills. They were sailing through their committees. I mean, including with our amendment on there, those bills never got a no vote. And basically in about the last 24 hours of session, they both got stopped, just dead in the water for reasons that had nothing to do with our legislation. So it was sort of heartbreaking to be that close and then have the rug pulled out from under you. But what's incredible is that we saw these unanimous votes from the full chamber, that every House member, every senator on bills that had those provisions. So it does give us a foot up to come back next year and say, it's the same concept. It's all about modernizing Florida's HIV laws. the time has come. We have advanced so much in our science for treatment and prevention in 3 decades since these laws were enacted. So we're excited to come back next year, maybe change up our strategy a little bit. The coalition, the Florida HIV Justice Coalition, is excited to come together this summer and talk about the best way to do that. But we know it's a matter of just getting across the finish line.
Right. This is a place where process has been a barrier, which is not unfamiliar. Lots of amazing ideas are introduced as legislation every year, and that process to get them over the finish line is why you need advocates fighting for you. So let's go to a question from the comments, y'all. Scott Bennett asked a question that feels simple, but it's not. and I think we could all have an answer for this. But Carlos, you were at Pulse at the 3-year mark. You were there with the governor in a moment that was a shifting moment for this community's relationship with its governor. Does it make sense to bring the governor into this process? And I'm going to add on to that, where do you think we are right now after that important visit?
Thank you for that question, Scott Bennett, and thank you for all of your support of our work over the many years. Look, I'm optimistic about the conversations we have had with Governor DeSantis and his team, and I'm also optimistic about whether or not this governor can, at some point during his 4 or 8 year term, can actually really be an advocate for LGBTQ Floridians. This all started when Governor DeSantis was the first sitting governor to make a official announced visit to Pulse nightclub on the 3-year mark. He made a promise, a public promise during that visit, which was on tape in case anyone ever wants to see it, that he would help us secure the funding that we needed for the Pulse Memorial. But it can't end there. And he's followed through with that because we got more funding in the budget this year for the memorial. We have to follow through with that by demanding the governor take action to protect our community. First and foremost, he can issue an executive order that would protect LGBTQ state employees from discrimination. He could also take the side of our kids and our students and our youth by prohibiting anti-LGBTQ discrimination that we know is pervasive and happening at our voucher-funded private schools in the state of Florida. But also, he can make a clear commitment to the legislature or make a signal to the legislature to pass Representative Webb's bill to protect all Floridians from LGBT Floridians from discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations, if he would just take that first step of protecting state employees, because that would signal to the legislature that he is a governor who cares about the rights and equality and fair treatment of all people, which includes LGBTQ Floridians. I don't know that he's there yet, but I'm invested in the long-term investment of trying to get him there through dialogue and education.
Yeah.
We've demanded every step of the way that anybody in elected office who seeks to do public good and serve all communities needs to serve ours, right? And they need to see us and they need to work with us. And I agree. I think that's where we begin, and we keep asking and we keep insisting and we keep demanding. You mentioned a really important topic, Carlos, and again, this is another place where a lot of us have a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts to share. But this question of discrimination in within private schools that receive public school vouchers was a defining issue of the legislative session, a huge issue. And it's worth talking about because I think I bet a lot of folks out there aren't really sure where we've landed. I mean, we know there wasn't any action taken, but there was intense scrutiny and press and advocacy around this. Maybe we can just round robin this, but Carlos, I know you were really, really active on this. Can you remind people what that challenge was? You mentioned it a little bit, and what happened this session, and also where you think it's going.
Right. Well, let me first explain to our members, or just remind them exactly what this issue is. We have about $1 billion. That's billion with a B, that of taxpayer resources that we use to send to private schools in the state of Florida through various voucher programs where a parent can take their child out of a public school and get a voucher to pay for tuition at this private school. So what it boils down to is this: thanks to an Orlando Sentinel expose and very good investigative reporting, we discovered that 83 voucher-funded private schools in the state of Florida, at minimum, have established policies in writing that say things like, students who say, I am gay or I am trans will be expelled from the school, period. That is the policy that has been established in at least 83 voucher-funded private schools. First and foremost, we know that that is wrong, that it is discrimination, and that it has to stop. But first and foremost, I think we can all agree as well that these private schools should not receive taxpayer money in the form of vouchers. So all session long, we tried to address the issue, and our solution, of course, was to just stop taxpayer funding of these private schools. Unfortunately, the majority did not side with us on that. They didn't hear legislation or pass any amendments that we put forward to try to fix the issue of discrimination. So we also looked for compromise solutions that were very watered down, if I'm being honest. They were solutions that were as weak as, let's use a state study to try to fully understand how much discrimination against LGBTQ students and others is really happening. They rejected even the idea of a study. They rejected proposals that just didn't end the discrimination, but only required, for example, transparency. Post this policy on your website so parents can make an informed decision about whether they want to send their kid to your school. Ultimately, where do we land? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They rejected, again, all proposals to address this, which was actually quite infuriating that was where we landed. But that is what we're up against in Tallahassee. We're up against a legislature right now that just basically gave a collective shoulder shrug to the proven discrimination that at this point is just sweeping across the board in at least 83 voucher-funded schools against LGBT kids. They didn't seem to think it was an issue. I disagree.
Absolutely. Rep Webb, did I see you jumping in there?
Well, and I think that this is where I think Rep Smith might be a little more optimistic about Governor DeSantis than I am. I think that libertarian ideology, when it comes to actual policy, really makes it hard for elected officials who hold those ideologies to tell private business what they should and should not do. And that's always the hang up. And that was the hang up with the school vouchers, even though it's public money, which makes absolutely no sense. Our dollars, our tax dollars should not be being used to discriminate against my family, your family, and our neighbors. But I think it's still that it's that private business and telling private business what to do. And that's the hurdle that I think that we're going to have to get through, especially as the libertarian strand of the Republican Party grows stronger and more and elects more and more representatives. And of course, the governor also ascribes to that brand of Republicanism. And so we're going to have new strategies for that, because
right.
what we're asking is exactly opposite of just letting business and the private industry do what they want. We're saying no, like if you're taking taxpayer dollars, you can't discriminate. You can't discriminate against our families when it comes to employment. And that's just, that rubs their ideology the wrong way. And I think that what we've seen through this current crisis is that they're not quick to move away from their ideology, even in the midst of a crisis, right? It's the last step that they do to mandate something. And so I think that where I have hope is we have some brilliant minds working on these issues. We have a vast network of supporters across the state. There is a growing sense of just repugnance at discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think that we do have momentum there. We're just going to have to make it so egregious for them not to regulate private industry that they have to do it.
Can I also just add one other thought, which is that so much of the discrimination against LGBTQ students that was happening at these voucher-funded private schools was happening at parochial or faith-based schools. Mm-hmm. Now, that is not to imply in any way, shape, or form that freedom of religion, respect for religion, and respect for LGBTQ students can't coexist. They can coexist, and they do all the time. In fact, you'll find many, many faith leaders in many different denominations understand and have lived this in how they not only practice their religion, but also the policies that they implement in their faith-based institutions, that they treat LGBTQ students with dignity and respect. The perfect example is a Catholic school, Trinity Prep, that's right here in the Orlando area that has policies in writing that say homophobia and transphobia against our students will not be tolerated and is grounds for discipline at the school, that they have very LGBTQ affirming policies at their school. And this is a Catholic school. They're doing it right, y'all. These are not mutually exclusive policies. And I reject the narrative that somehow freedom of religion and respect for LGBTQ people are just two irreconcilable differences. We got to really figure out how this works. No, we don't. We've already figured it out. We have already looked at our own history. You can look at what happened with Bob Jones University when they clung to some bogus claim that their religion compelled them to segregate Black students away from the white students in their university. The courts disagreed and told them that they were no longer eligible to receive taxpayer money if they continue to do such. I don't see very much difference between posting a sign that says whites only in your restaurant versus posting a policy on your private school's website that says if you say I am gay or I am trans, or if you come from a same-sex relationship, we don't take your kind and you will not be allowed to enroll in this institution.
Absolutely. Well, we said it at the beginning of this call, or at the beginning of our time together, there are lots and lots of issues to discuss and lots of places we can dig in. We have gotten word from our producers that we can go over just a little bit here, and I am going to ask that we take that time because there is one other issue I want to make sure we hit before we close. But first, let me just pause and thank everybody who's joined us here today and who is watching live from home, either on YouTube or through Facebook. If you have not liked the Equality Florida Facebook page and YouTube account, please subscribe to us. Please like us. Our comms team is working in overdrive in this COVID crisis to provide dynamic digital content for you. We're doing one of these town halls every Thursday. We've covered some really amazing issues that cover the gamut of concerns that not just people in Florida, but LGBTQ folks and pro-equality folks across the country care about. Please stay tuned in for that. And finally, if you've taken one thing away from this town hall, I hope it is a deep belief that every single day people at Equality Florida wake up and think about how we can make the lives of people who are LGBTQ better. That as much progress as we have made, we don't stop the bad things and move forward on the good things without working really, really hard and really, really smart. And so if you believe in that work and you're as committed to that mission as everybody on this call, I want to let you know that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is matching contributions 100% dollar for dollar in an unlimited capacity between now and April 30th. So you may have seen that link in the comment section. I'm going to ask our comms colleagues to post that again. Know that any gift you make to our work in this moment will be doubled dollar for dollar. And there's never been a more important time for Equality Florida and our staff and team to be healthy and strong as we fight for you in Florida. So I hope you'll consider making a gift whatever that is, whatever is meaningful to you and your family, to us tonight, as a thank you maybe for this dynamic conversation. For all three of us, for all of us on this call, but for the three of you, our esteemed panelists, I think we have to talk about COVID, and let's take 5 minutes on that, or more, a few minutes more, because, well, first let me say, I just from who we see as participating in the comment thread, I think most people who are watching this are probably at this point following along on like the top headlines, right? Where we think we are in the epidemic in the state, knowing that regionally it's shifting, the broad relief package that's come out of the federal government. So perhaps we can put that away slightly for a second. Here's what I'm interested in from the folks on this call. Maybe two questions and we can just round robin it. One, in this crisis, who are you most worried about? Where do you think our eyes need to turn? Who are the most unseen right now that you want to shift our focus to, either in the LGBT community or outside of it? And second, as the political savants that we all are, as the people who eat, sleep, and breathe the quagmire that is Florida politics, what do you think is next? What do you think people who are paying attention to this town hall need to be thinking about and anticipating, and how the state and our state government is going to respond next to this crisis?
Carla, go first.
So, and thank you for that. Well, I'm worried about a lot of people, especially our frontline healthcare workers, which is why we're doing everything that we can to make sure, obviously, that they have the equipment that they need to protect themselves. But also, I think the most important way that we can protect our healthcare workers and honor the work that they're doing is by staying at home and following good, strong social distancing guidelines, because they're doing this for us and we have to pay the favor back however we can. But I know that a lot of folks are also hearing a lot about the healthcare disparities that COVID-19 is presenting to Black and Brown communities. That has me very worried and very frustrated, because every time we have a national tragedy, why is it that it seems like the most vulnerable, the most economically marginalized amongst us are always the ones who bear the brunt of the crisis and have to make the sacrifice, whether it be through healthcare implications or even, unfortunately, the rising death toll that we see across the state and across the country. We know that many Black and Brown Floridians who are disproportionately vulnerable, not only because of their own status as a Black and Brown person and their ethnicity, but they're also more vulnerable because they're also disproportionately our workers who are going out there, who are perhaps a frontline healthcare worker who is a nurse, or perhaps they are one of our workers in our grocery stores, one of our bus drivers, who one of our food workers, someone who's in agriculture, who's growing food and is out there laboring in the direct sunlight. You know, these folks are for some reason not considered essential when we are not in a pandemic, but suddenly we're in a pandemic and folks who make these low wages are considered essential, and they're making a sacrifice for us to make sure that we have the food that we need, to make sure that we have the groceries that we need, and to make sure that we're getting the healthcare that we need. And they're often doing it at minimum wage, barely a living wage. So they're the ones who I think are most vulnerable. And I think it is incumbent upon the state, because we're not in Congress. We adjourned our session on, what was it, the 19th of March, and we finished and we acted like, oh, our work is done here, nothing left to do, let's all go home. No, we have a pandemic. I believe we need a special legislative session so that lawmakers can not only revise the budget and make sure that we expand resources for the unemployed through our unemployment program, expand 12 weeks to 26 weeks, increase the flimsy, stingy $275 weekly state unemployment benefit to perhaps maybe the national average of $385. We expand Medicaid in the state of Florida as we see folks are losing access to insurance because they've lost their jobs, and many, many, many other things that have to be addressed right now, but the state is not addressing them.
Rep Webb, who are you? Who are you looking for? Who are you worried about?
So I think that Rep Smith hit on a lot of things. Our state has had a lot of cracks that have been blown open through this crisis and have been exposed through this crisis. So whether it's our Department of Children and Family Services, we only had 4 weeks ago, we had one organization that families who needed food stamps or TANF or WIC could go and get assistance with filling out their application in the entire county of Pinellas County. 3 weeks ago, we were 1 week away of running out of food for our neediest families in Pinellas County. 2 weeks ago was the website for DEO for the unemployment, or what we call reemployment, which is so stupid, but the unemployment support was giving everybody trouble. Now it's the call center. We have chronically underfunded our state safety nets for our families in Florida. And we've done this knowing that 42% in the Tampa Bay area of families are one paycheck away from homelessness. And so that also tells me that they've had to rely on these systems in the past to a greater or lesser extent, and they've had to bear the brunt of having inadequate services from being provided to them for the state. And so, and so I'm worried. I mean, I'm worried in a general way about our families. I'm of course worried about the people who don't have the money to tide them over until the $1,200 stimulus check comes. I think people are honestly more worried about the financial implications for their family. And that's saying something, that amid a global health crisis in America, our families are worried about how they're going to put food on the table and pay their bills and their mortgage. And so my office has been working around the clock to get information out to people. And the shorthand is just like, call the people who you normally write the bills to and talk to them. Most people will work with you. I'm also worried that during times of financial stress, rates of domestic violence go up, rates of suicide go up, and children abuse towards children also goes up. And we didn't get to the question in the beautiful script that John Harris crafted for us because we went into great details elsewhere. But this hits on the point of not all families are equally supportive. And when it comes to our LGBTQ plus community, a lot of times schools are the place where kids go for relief. Our youth centers are where kids go to feel not so alone and afraid and isolated. And right now they're not able to access that support. And so I'm really challenging our community partners in the Tampa Bay area and across the state, since this is a statewide platform, to figure out how to reach those kids, how to reach those kids in unique ways. And I know that the call that Equality Florida is doing with legislators has really been touching on some of that, but it is so important because it's a tragedy when you lose an individual to a health crisis because they've actually had COVID-19, but it is just unconscionable that I believe that we are going to lose a lot of people because of the mental and social stress that this has put them under, and that those families will be forever changed too. And so I am very worried about them right now. Absolutely. And what's next? I think that this is an opportunity. So I don't want to people are dying, this is an opportunity. I never knew that I was an optimist until I got into politics, but our system has been exposed. Our state systems have been exposed as the broken messes that they really are. And now we can choose to rebuild them, and we can fight to rebuild them in a way that makes sense, that builds on people's compassion and calls people together to support each other, having just had this common shared experience of fighting to get unemployment, for fighting to get food, for working so hard to figure out how to educate their kids from home. So there's all of these common experiences that we have had as Floridians, and we can use those experiences to make a better Florida that works better for all of our families. And I think there's hope there.
Absolutely. The advocacy that we've seen just from the nonprofit sector broadly, but from our LGBTQ community more narrowly, has been earth-shattering, has been phenomenal. The way that we all convene to solve some of these problems together has been exceptionally inspiring. John Harris, what do you think? Where does your Eye of Sauron go?
Sure. I guess when I think about my primary worry, it's not a who, it's a what. And so I think I started in one of the places that Representative Webb ended, and that what is community? Because to me, that's what feels most important right now, and where we're seeing that breakdown is where people are really at risk. And so one of the things that I frankly hadn't thought of, because it's been out of my universe for a while, but is our LGBTQ youth and young people. And so that is, as our Safe and Healthy Schools program has been talking about, students who might have had a safe place in their schools and a supportive peer network there that now don't have that. Now they may not have the option of, having those GSA meetings where they can use their proper pronouns or be affirmed by their friends. Or it may be a little bit older folks in our community who are at college or otherwise living outside the house for the first time, or were living outside the house for the first time. And now they're having to go back home in this moment of crisis to maybe an environment that's just unsupportive, maybe one that's actually hostile. And so that loss of community is really critical to me. And I think it runs the gamut in our community, certainly not just at the margin of our youngest folks, but also for our LGBTQ elders. I mean, we know that already there's a state of anxiety around susceptibility to COVID-19. And when you layer that in with being one of our LGBTQ elders, I mean, these are the folks who are the foundation of our movement, the folks on whose shoulders we get to stand and do this work now, that may, not be fully aware of the rights that they have to protect themselves from discrimination in an assisted living facility, or whatever, what have you. And they may not have, again, the network of peers. In some cases, because you have folks who have lived through the height of the HIV and AIDS epidemics, and they've lost so many friends, and they don't have that same community. Maybe was already smaller, and now it's shrunk all the more in this moment of crisis. So I think that community is so important, and I'm really heartened by all the efforts and all the creative ways we see people coming up with to stay in touch, keep in contact, try to engage folks, and bring some of that normalcy back into community and create it in new ways that we're challenged to do in this moment.
Well, the place that I've found center in this moment, which, Rep. Webb, I appreciate your point. You don't want to end heavy, but I think it's fair to say that right now the world feels a little heavier, and there are real challenges. There are defining challenges that are broader than our community, but bias and bigotry and all of the monsters we've all been battling our entire lives and careers make worse, right? We know our community experiences marginalization even in times of crisis in profound ways. And so I just kind of go back to that expression, that phrase that a lot of us hear in moments like this, which is, in moments of crisis, look for the helpers. Yeah. We see that in our community. I think all four of the people on this call are called to be helpers. And if you are paying attention to our way overtime Facebook Live, you are probably a helper too. And that is why I'm going to ask for your help one last time. If you believe in the work of Equality Florida and believe that we are making a difference both through this crisis for our community, but every year in the Florida legislative environment, I want to ask you to consider making a gift of support today. Any gift made to Equality Florida through the AIDS Healthcare Foundation will be matched by our partners at the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, dollar for dollar. It is an unlimited match. Anything that you give will be matched up to April 30th. And so our comms colleagues are going to throw that link to make a gift of support for you, from you and your family at whatever level is meaningful to you up on that comment thread now. Thank you all so much for coming. I want to give a very special thank you to our dynamic, incredible, inspiring panelists of experts, the very first openly LGBT Latinx member of the Florida legislature, who is right now pointing you to how you can get in touch with him in his office, State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith.
Right
the
there.
very first lesbian lawmaker in Tallahassee, Florida State Representative Jennifer Webb, and the first wife of Nathaniel, John Harris Maurer, who is also the Public Policy Director of Equality Florida and one of the smartest people I know. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and stay tuned in. We've got more dynamic programs for you from Equality Florida Live.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.